I wanted to start by thanking Linda for inviting me to participate. This is exciting. I've enjoyed both talks so far, and it's neat to learn about the different contexts. And my talk's going to be similar to Colleen's from the perspective I'm looking at state and federal policies related to teaching out of field. So what I want to start with is just to make sure that everybody's on the same page about the US context. So the federal laws that address issues of teaching, and they explicitly address issues of teaching out of field. We had the No Child Left Behind Act in 2002 that allowed teaching out of field only in very rare cases. Teachers had to be considered highly qualified, which meant essentially they had to be trained to teach the subjects that they were teaching. That changed in 2015 with a new federal policy called the Every Student Succeeds Act. That new policy actually allows teaching out of field, but it defines it from an equity standpoint, which I thought was interesting. It says that if you allow teaching out of field, or if you have teachers who are teaching classes out of field, then it has to be equitably distributed among your students. So the different demographic variable, if you group the students by demographic variables, the students have to be treated equally. If you're a rural student or an urban student, then the out-of-field teaching rates have to be similar across the different groups. So to understand the Texas context, because in some ways it sounds like it's very different from the Australian context, teachers in Texas can hold certification or licenses in lots of different subjects. So it addresses that issue of somebody went through their undergraduate and potentially master's degrees and got trained in something, but then received additional professional development. They can get licenses for each of the different subjects that they have demonstrated the skills and knowledge to teach them. So they take a test that demonstrates their pedagogical content knowledge, and then they are licensed to teach that additional subject. It sounds somewhat similar and somewhat different in that we have different grade bands of the different licenses. So from early childhood through grade 6, you're a generalist, but in the 4 through 8 and the secondary grades, they're subject specific. So you can get certified to teach biology, you can get certified to teach chemistry, physics, maths, things like that. And Texas has very detailed rules for what licenses correspond to what classes you can teach. So it's a very clear definition of who is teaching in field or out of field. So this is an example of teachers who teach maths in grades 9 through 12. You can hold any one of these licenses and you are considered in field. If you don't hold one of these licenses, then you're considered out of field. This document is 110 pages long, showing the relationship between licensures and courses that can be taught. And it goes through all the different kinds of courses that you might see in any of the grade levels. So I want to make clear that when I use the term out of field, I'm referring to the classes and not to the teacher, him or herself. So I look at out of field teaching similar to what we've heard already this morning or today, is that out of field is not a characteristic of the teacher, but a description of the misalignment between the teacher's qualifications and the course being taught. So a teacher who holds a chemistry license or certification in Texas and teaches chemistry is teaching in field, but that same teacher teaching algebra would be teaching out of field. And I love Ingersoll's quote about teaching out of field is equivalent to assigning a cardiologist to deliver babies, or a real estate lawyer to defend criminal cases, a chemical engineer to design bridges, or a sociology professor to teach English. To me, it's just, it's bad policy. Because we know that teaching out of field matters. That when teaching out of field happens, there's less student academic growth, there's lower quality instruction in general, and there's higher teacher attrition. So the research questions that my colleague and I were looking at were, did the rate of out-of-field assignment change when we went from the No Child Left Behind Act to the Every Student Succeeds Act? So there was the federal policy that then trickled down into the state policies. And then because the focus in the Every Student Succeeds Act was on equity, we wanted to look at it from an equity perspective. Is it equitable for teachers who are being assigned to the different kinds of classes, and is it equitable for students? And what we did is, this is a large-scale quantitative study. We used a P20 data warehouse, and what I did is I compiled 300 million records of every student, every class, every teacher, and every licensure that the teacher held. And from that 300 million records, I took a sample of 180 million, which was just the classes in grades 7 through 12, just the secondary grades. And so that constituted 14.9 million different classes. So this is, I'm actually looking at the class level, the particular period class. And so I analyzed these 180 million records, and what I'm going to talk about is the basis of is based on these data. And I used the official state published rules on what constitutes in-field or out-of-field. So what we found for the first research question was that there was a dramatic increase. This is when the policy changed at the federal level. And this line looks fairly flat here, but it's actually, there's no significant change year to year on this side of the line, but every year after the policy changed, the change was significant increase in the number of classes that were being taught out of field. And then you see an astronomical increase in the final year of the data that we had available. So then what we did is we looked at it by the 25 most common subjects that are being taught in grades 7 through 12. And this is ranked from the highest in-field teaching rates to the lower ones. The really low ones are off the chart. But what you can see is the STEM fields, where in Texas it was believed that that's the highest out-of-field teaching rates, actually have some of the lowest out-of-field teaching rates relatively. You can see math, almost 76% of the teachers, the classes were being taught in field. But we're looking at over 2 million different classes. So we're talking about over 500,000 classes that are still being taught out of field. So it sounds like a small percentage, but because the number is big, we're talking an enormous number of kids who are being impacted by this. And this was, I found super surprising, is that the English classes are actually being taught out of field at a higher rate than the math and STEM classes were. Okay, so research question 2 was about the equity of the teacher assignment. And what we found was that teachers were not equitably being assigned. It varied by demographic variables and training characteristics. So we found that if you were a Black teacher in Texas, you were significantly more likely to be assigned out of field classes. If you were prepared through, Texas is one of the leaders in alternative teacher preparation, mostly through for-profit companies. If you were trained through an alternative preparation program, then you were much more likely to teach out of field classes. If you were, again, like is in Australia, if you're working in rural. And I expected to see, similar to what Linda was talking about, or Colleen was talking about, the newer teachers teaching out of field at a higher rate. And I found that the older the teacher was, the more likely they were to be teaching out of field. And then we have a pedagogy licensure test that they also have to pass. And the lower they scored on that test, the more likely they were to teach out of field, which I thought was really interesting. And we want to dig into this more. Research question 3 was about the student equity issue. Are students being equitably allocated or assigned or taking classes out of field versus in field? And the answer is no. If you're a Black student, you're much more likely to take classes out of field. Same thing for males. So females take more in-field classes, males take more out-of-field classes. You come from a low-income family, regardless of the SES of the school you're in. If you come from a low-income, if you come from a low-income family, then you're more likely to have a class that's out of field. Again, living in rural communities, if you're receiving special education services, you're much more likely to take out-of-field classes, and if you're a non-native English speaker. So we recently published this study. Amy Piot was a grad student that worked with me on this study, so it was recently published. And so we also did a couple additional analyses that they're preliminary. We haven't finished them yet. But what we were looking at was the teachers, new teachers are rated by their principal for quality and effectiveness. And we looked at the principal ratings of new teachers as a function of whether the number of classes the principal had assigned the teacher to teach out of field. And what we found is each additional class that the principal assigned the teacher to out of field, the lower the principal rated that teacher. And the rating is done at the end of the school year. So they assign them to teach out of field, and then they give them lower ratings, which have impacts on teacher preparation programs in Texas. And then we also found that teacher attrition is higher. What we're also trying to look at is the school employment environment, and is that, does that explain more of the attrition, or is it the teaching out of field rate that explains more of it? So the implications were that federal policies can impact principals' assignments of teachers to the classes in substantial ways. Part of the idea behind the federal policy was to give states local control and to define their own education policies. Well, what we're seeing is in Texas, when you give Texas government local control, then the teaching out of field increased dramatically. Teachers are not treated equitably and students are not treated equitably. So next steps for this study is we're going to finish the principal evaluation analysis and the attrition analyses. Since I've got the 180 million records already set up, I'm going to do value-added modeling and look at student academic outcomes across the different subjects. And then we're also trying to find out what is it in schools where there's a high out-of-field teaching rates, and yet students seem to be doing well, or teachers are staying at the school. Are there things that the principal is doing or that the teacher professional learning communities are doing to support each other that other schools could adopt to counteract the negative effects of teaching out of field? So we've been looking for grant funding for this last one because of the travel that would be involved. All right.